Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the disorder and anarchy in the Jewish community. Yes, the Jewish community. Hefker is a very important word. In Hebrew, it's a concept of total disarray. It means that there is no organizational structure. It is a form of anarchy. Hefker happens where there is no central rule. It is hefker when and where a minimum standard of behavior is no longer adhered to. COVID-19 is wreaking havoc on the world, and the Jewish community is not immune to its destructive force. As a consequence of COVID, hefker now rules in many shuls and synagogues, temples across America. Religious institutions have been instructed to undergo a shift in business as usual. Numbers of worshipers have been severely restricted. Prayer length has been shortened. Participants have been asked to wear masks and to socially distance, and many do. But many is not all. And too many flaunt the system. That's where the problem emerges. There are entire areas in Brooklyn, New York, areas where large numbers of Jews live and pray, where almost no one wears masks, not in synagogue and not on the streets. There is certainly not social distancing. In other parts of New York, suburban areas, upstate, around in the tri-state area, prayer areas are inside buildings and outside buildings, on lawns, in parking lots, even under tents. There are porch groups, there are backyard minyanim, where people engage in ad hoc prayer. Some offer those who come to daven a choice. And this is interesting. Choose the location that best fits your new lifestyle. Choices include a section where mask wearers are seated. Others are a section where, if you prefer not to wear a mask, you blend in. Both are there. They all get takers. There are synagogues where kids are permitted and synagogues where they are not. In some, they're required to sit next to their parents and not roam around. And in others, children can roam around freely. Sometimes there is an age requirement, in others not at all. Many people, and this is a critical component, many people who choose not to wear masks and not to social distance taunt those who do. They flaunt their independent decision-making and call the other group alarmists and extremists. They flaunt their non-compliance. There are not supposed to be social gatherings at all in many of these places. They're just supposed to go and pray. That would include the long-held tradition of having a communal kiddush after prayers. But many shuls and many backyard minyanim and many private people are actually inviting for kiddush. There's one particular example, I got a tweet the other day, where there was a private kiddush and 40 people afterwards tested positively. Hefker, plain and simple, hefker. Shuls, synagogues, temples are suffering. Many formerly regular, dependable shul goers are staying away, and that makes sense because they're afraid. COVID is scary. Some people are staying away from almost everything and everybody, not just places of worship. Some are staying away from synagogues because they feel uncomfortable, knowing that not everyone is observing the pandemic rules and regulations that stringently say that certain things and behaviors must be adhered to. Even as shuls begin to open, and they are opening, as rabbis and responsible leaders ease up on some of the restrictions as they're being eased upon, they are not at peak attendance. Ad hoc prayer groups have become comfortable for many daveners. What would be a temporary disruption in our lives back in March has become a new normal. Some people have discovered that they actually like praying at home, alone, or they like the feel of the small group. It's the case even in the Orthodox world. For many, attending synagogues, more important than prayer was socializing. And if there is no kiddush and no socializing, there really is, for many people, no reason to attend. That does not mean that they are assimilating or violating the Sabbath or taking their kids out of Jewish day schools. It means that they are not attending synagogue, not attending because spiritually they do not need to attend. And Dr. Fauci and the CDC and the governors and the religious leaders have sanctioned the act of not going to a brick and mortar place of worship and not davening with a minyan. The synagogue model is teetering and will almost certainly collapse. And this is important because the high holidays are fast approaching. Traditionally, high holidays is a period when even those who do not regularly attend services attend. They buy high holiday seats and tickets. It is the season when people make contributions, donating money in memory of their loved ones. The annual Yizkor book has become a valuable fundraiser for many communities and congregations. Bottom line, in addition to the spiritually uplifting side of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it was a synagogue moneymaker. Over the years, the high holidays has provided a significant source of needed revenue for operational budgets of shuls. This year, that is changing. COVID and Hefker, the two together, have combined to become a 1-2 punch that just might knock out the model of the synagogue as we know it. COVID and Hefker may have caused the destruction of the synagogue as we know it today. If a synagogue was simply a prayer room where people came and left with almost no expenses, they could manage and weather this crisis. But most shuls and temples and synagogues across America have a business model that articulates that they are much more than simply a prayer room. They are a place for classes and children's groups and catering events and all kinds of other simchas and many, many other things that take place there. All that costs money and brings in money. And most of that, in some places, all of that, is now gone. The business model of a synagogue must change if the industry called Jewish organization and organized prayer hopes to survive. Zoom teaching is just one vehicle of the change, but it is only one. With Zoom or virtual learning, anyone can, located anywhere in the world, can potentially click on, usually for free. Even before coronavirus, synagogues were dying a slow death. And this is where it's important to get a sense, because with few exceptions, and rentals aside, most Jewish buildings today have fewer than 30 people under their roof at a single moment, more than once a week. That's hardly a very positive business model, an effective at least one. If synagogues hope to survive, they must rein in the non-compliant and make it a place where everyone feels safe. They must be creative. Orthodox, conservative, reformer, constructionists, and the larger group, actually a very fast-growing group, I should say, the unaffiliated synagogues and temples must create an entirely virtual world that is dynamic, enticing, and magnetizing. If synagogues hope to survive, they must answer 3 basic questions. 1, why should I join? 2, why should I give you my hard-earned money in a time where it's very difficult? And 3, what am I going to get in return for my membership? And then they must provide 2 very different models of answers. They must give virtual answers, and they must give brick and mortar answers. If they fail, even long after COVID, Hefker will prevail. I've also been thinking about Islam, and I think it behooves us to learn a little bit more about Islam, and that's valuable to understand. It's just the Eid, or Eid al-Adha, as it's referred to, is one of the 2 most important holidays of Islam, that together with Eid al-Fitr. But the Eid al-Adha takes precedence. It's actually more important. It's actually more important than the 2. And Eid al-Adha translates from Arabic to the festival of the sacrifice. It is found in the Quran in section 30 of Surah 30, lines 100 to 112. It is the parallel story of the binding of Isaac from Genesis 22. The holiday is known as Eid al-Qurban also. Qurban is a synonym for sacrifice. It's actually the exact word in Hebrew also. This year, it began on July 31st. In the Quranic version of the story, Allah challenges Ibrahim and his faith and commands him to take Ishmael, his son, not Isaac, which is in the Genesis story, and offer him as a sacrifice. In the end, Allah intervenes and stops the sacrifice, just like it is in the story of Genesis. And Ibrahim's faith has been proven. The Quran's rendition is a near exact replica of the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Bible itself. At the end of the Quranic story, a sheep is replaced for Ishmael. In the Bible, a ram takes the place of Isaac. Eid al-Adha is as much a feast as it is a holiday. The feast is traditionally a 4-day celebration of food and prayers and family. An entire sheep is slaughtered and prepared. 2/3 of the sheep is eaten by the family, and a third goes to the poor. But we are not living in normal times, and many Islamic traditions, like almost all other traditions and behaviors because of COVID, had to shift and morph to accommodate COVID-19. This year, because of COVID, coupled with the crippling financial crisis, the Islamic population of the West Bank, let's say, for instance, has scaled down their celebrations. The sale of animals has dropped more than 50%, according to some slaughterhouses and animal sellers. Many families are abandoning the traditional sheep and instead pooling their funds and buying larger animals, like a cow. This year, at the same time as the Eid al-Adha festival is taking place, the Hajj is also taking place in Mecca. The Hajj is an annual 5-day pilgrimage to Mecca, which is located, of course, in Saudi Arabia. One of the 5 pillars of Islam. It is the reenactment of Muhammad's life, and every Muslim hopes to make a pilgrimage once in their lifetime. Mecca is a closed city only for Muslims. They're the only ones who may enter. 2.5 million Muslims usually descend on Mecca during the Hajj. But, once again, nothing is usual in the year 2020. This year, in deference to COVID, Saudi leadership has limited the number of worshippers to a mere 1,000, not 2.5 million, 1,000. It was a very wise and cautious move because 270,000 Saudis have coronavirus. They have had 2,800 deaths. No one not already living or stationed in Saudi Arabia can be part of the chosen 1,000. No one from any other Middle East countries. No Muslims from any other country, like India, which normally sends 200,000 worshippers a year to the Hajj. The Saudis also decided to issue every attendee a wristband with a GPS chip connected to their phones. The wristband must be worn at all times so that the devotees are trackable at all times. Should someone fall ill, the tracker can identify all those who are close to him. The Saudis also designed special colorful dress for attendees to don. The dresses are treated with nano-silver, a material that prevents contagion. They also drew lines on the ground, on the floor, much like you would see in an Olympic track meet, and everyone was to walk on their line. The Saudis also gave out special colorful umbrellas, which when open ensured safe social distancing was maintained. During the pilgrimage to the Hajj, Muslims circle the Kaaba, the big, huge black rock in Mecca. They circle it 7 times, walking counterclockwise. They walk around and around and around, moving closer to the Kaaba. Certainly the last 3 cycles, you move even closer to the Kaaba. The Hajj, with each circle, changes their own color of umbrella and dress as they move closer and closer to the Kaaba itself. It makes for a splendid, well choreographed, and even extremely non-traditional image. Bending the strictures, of COVID again. No one over the age of 50 is permitted in the Hajj today. Gone are the wheelchairs which permitted the elderly or the ill or the infirm from fulfilling their lifelong dreams. This year, only those between the ages of 20 and 50 could make the pilgrimage. And they're checking several times a day to make sure that they arrive healthy, remain healthy. They're taking their temperatures constantly. After completing the Hajj, the 5-day Hajj, pilgrims must quarantine for a week before returning to their homes. Now, the changes were made because they needed to be made. They were made because of COVID, but they were not made easily. Change does not come quickly or easily in Islam. Some changes or modifications may be only temporary. The lesson we are learning from them should be a long and lasting lesson. When necessary, when prudent, when well advised, Muslim religious leadership can break with tradition and make significant adjustments to that tradition. Christianity had the Reformation. Judaism had the Reformation. Islam did not. Islam never had the Reformation. The significance of reformations was that reforms were instituted. Their real essence was not ideological or theological. It was societal. The reforms allowed religious leadership to blend and integrate modern society and issues into long-held tradition. This idea has very important ramifications for Islam as it faces the challenges it confronts when it confronts modernity. COVID, in the most ironic way, might just be the starting point for reform within Islam. Coming up next, points of view. Both columns today come from Ynet. Ynet is a website of Yediot Achronot. They have a Hebrew website, and they have an English version of their Hebrew website. It is an excellent site with a wonderful resource for info, news, insight about Israel and Jewish affairs. These columns were written by two of their best columnists. The first one is by Ron Ben-Ishai. Now, what happens in this is that he's their military columnist. Ron's expertise is not just about Israel's military, but about the military and capabilities of Israel's enemies. The piece was published on August 1st, 2020. It is entitled, "Israel Missed Its Chance to Create a Deterrence Against Hezbollah." Then there's a caption underneath it, analysis. While decision to allow cell that tried to infiltrate IDF outposts in the north to flee was right one under the current circumstances, it does mean a lost opportunity to launch preemptive strike to both disarm, group, and discredit it in eyes of the Arab world. So the strange thing, because they left out a lot of words because it was a caption. Ben-Ishai argues that the failed attempt of Hezbollah to invade Israel was a missed opportunity for Israel to hurt Hezbollah. This is how he begins. Try to imagine, if you will, a different scenario than the one that took place on Monday in Mount Dov, in which IDF troops shot to kill the Hezbollah cell that tried to sneak into a military outpost instead of simply firing a few warning shots. There is little doubt that Hezbollah would have responded by firing a few anti-tank missiles and mortar rounds in order to cover the escape of those who were left alive to prevent the IDF from collecting the bodies and equipment left behind. If the IDF spokesman's unit had released a video of this scenario, it would have served to utterly humiliate Hezbollah in the eyes of Lebanon and the entire Arab world. Hezbollah would have then opened fire on Israel, not only to dilute the impact of its spectacular failure in the eyes of the people, but mainly because the organization under Hassan Nasrallah lives with the illusion that they must retaliate every time Israel kills one of its people in order to maintain a balance of deterrence. Ben-Ishai explains that in this particular case, Israel could have embarrassed Hezbollah and hit them. Hezbollah would have attempted more small attacks with a few rockets, all of which would have been repelled. Israel would attack again. Hezbollah would fail again. In the eyes of the Arab world, Hezbollah would have been humiliated. That's not what happened. Now, Ben-Ishai explains that Lebanon is powerless to control Hezbollah. He writes, the lack of sufficient financial and sanitary resources, such as hospital beds, will also surely prevent the government from successfully managing a security crisis, not to mention the current political leadership crisis that bodes nothing but bad news during wartime. Therefore, the decision to show restraint was the right call. But if Nasrallah is arrogant and irresponsible enough to retaliate, action must be taken. A preventive strike is the best way to get rid of the organization's missiles, thus eliminating the threat and creating a deterrence. And while this was not the right time, Nasrallah is sure to give us more opportunities in the future. Next up is a column by Ben Dror Yemini. He needs no introduction to those who watch JBS. This piece ran in Ynet on July 31st, the day before Ron Ben-Ishai's piece, and it's about the same topic. It's entitled, Lebanon is Paying for Hezbollah's Illogical Games. The caption reads, Lebanese-based terror group must show its sponsor Iran it is still relevant, and that means keeping conflict with Israel alive. After all, radical Islamic groups have always opted to invest in military might above their people's welfare. Ben Dror is trying to explain, and this is his point, he comes to the very same conclusion of Ben-Ishai, that Lebanon is hurting because of Hezbollah. This is how he begins. Israel's northern border has been quiet for almost a decade and a half, since the end of the 2006 Second Lebanon War. It's one of the most criticized conflicts in Israeli history, and yet it has provided calm on the northern front. Last Monday's attempted infiltration by a Hezbollah cell, ended without casualties, as did an earlier incident in September of last year. Perhaps these are rules of the game Hezbollah and Israel are playing, but even so, there is no doubt that the border with Lebanon, certainly in comparison with the early 2000s, is very quiet. There is a cause for concern, though. Since the end of the fighting in 2006 and until today, Hezbollah has been arming itself with massive amounts of missiles and rockets. There are 130,000 missiles aimed at targets all over Israel, according to estimates. With or without Hezbollah's efforts to turn many of these missiles into precision weapons, which Israel has purportedly been working hard to foil, and with or without any more weapons systems, this arsenal poses a threat to Israel's safety. It is logical to argue that Lebanon does not need nor desire an additional confrontation with Israel, which would cause destruction to its infrastructure, or, as some in Israel have warned, plunge the country back in the Middle Ages. Ben Dror's fear for stability of Lebanon and the region is absolutely correct. His fear of Hezbollah is 100% true. He writes, and this is how he starts the conclusion, "We must hope there is no war looming, for the only successful wars are those that are averted. But we are living in a region that is governed by different rules of logic. Lebanon has been refusing international aid because it may well affect Hezbollah's power in the country. Hamas prefers more weapons over huge investments in welfare of its people. And Iran prefers to divert funds to its nuclear program and its proxies over its own civilians. We may hope that the recent incident on the northern border is over, but we must be aware that our neighbors and their priorities have not changed." Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I'm going to show you 3 cartoons today. All 3 are about COVID, and they all made me smile, and that's actually the litmus test for me showing you cartoons today. The first is a bingo card of different ways people wear their masks. Look at each one carefully, take a few seconds. They literally depict reality so clearly. We know each one of these mask wearers. Next up is a ventriloquist, a doll with a doll on its knee. And the ventriloquist, who is wearing a mask, obviously, is talking to his wife, who is wearing a mask. The doll is not. The ventriloquist turns towards his wife and says, "I think I really may have a shot at this now." That's funny. Very funny. Finally, we have a picture of a 2-car collision. It's messy, ugly. It's an awful accident. The caption reads, "Both drivers were taken to the hospital for possible coronavirus complications." This is a play on the very strange reality that almost anyone who dies for whatever reason, who tests positive for COVID, even without symptoms, is called a COVID death. Most people who test positive, by the way, do not even show symptoms. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. The Palestinian Authority looks to be teetering, actually even on the verge of imploding. The chaos that will emerge if or when this happens is not good for anyone in the region, not for Palestinians, not for Israelis, not for the entire region. If the PA falls, the only power poised to fill its void is Hamas. That is a 100% inevitability. And if Hamas takes charge in the West Bank, they will turn the area into an even bigger failed mess than Gaza. They will make it into an even bigger failure than Gaza itself. If you think that the West Bank is dysfunctional now, imagine if Hamas was in charge. There are several indicators of the instability in the PA. It is apparent that the PA President Abbas is no longer leading and directing. COVID plus economic difficulties, plus Israel's annexation threats, are huge obstacles that Abbas is not properly embracing. Rather than inspiring the masses, Abbas has activated his traditional tropes whereby he automatically turns Israel into the enemy and root of all of their problems. He has called out the world to condemn Israel and called for aid and assistance. This old strategy is no longer working. In order for Abbas to build a stable society and the tradition and transfer of power to a successor, whoever that may be, In order for him to push Hamas out of the equation, he needs to work together with Israel, especially in terms of security and safety. Israel has a vested interest in keeping Abbas in power. Israel is working to maintain the PA's president's safety and protect him from Hamas especially. Abbas, however, is not working with Israel. Another mysterious explosion took place in Iran. You know it. This time, 6 fuel trucks exploded while in a parking lot in Dolat Abad. Simultaneously, the trucks were in the industrial area of Kermanshah. Now, they were filled with fuel, and the burning took a very long time. It could be seen from miles and miles away. The deputy head of Kermanshah's fire department said that while few people were injured, nobody died in the explosions. He said the explosions are under investigation. The questions are obvious. How are these mysterious explosions happening? Who is responsible for these fires? What is the link between all of these explosions that have plagued Iran? One theory is Israel, of course. Another is the United States, or local saboteurs is a third. Maybe it's a combination of all three of them. Iran dragged out a life-size model of a U.S. aircraft carrier, and then the tugboat was bringing it out into the Straits of Hormuz. The model aircraft carrier was in the fashion of the USS Nimitz. In other words, it's called a Nimitz-class carrier. It just so happens that the USS Abraham Lincoln is in the region, and another USS carrier is close by. The real Nimitz just made its appearance in the region in entering the Middle Eastern waters from the Indian Ocean, and will probably replace the USS Dwight Eisenhower. Why would Iran drag out a life-size model of a USS carrier? That's easy. They're going to use it for target practice, and they did. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. We looked at 2 columns today, both who have the name Ben. Ben, of course, means son in Hebrew. In Aramaic, the language of the Talmud, the word is bar, like bar mitzvah. Before last names came into existence, we were referred to as someone, ben someone else, or bat someone else. In religious life, like when being called up to the Torah, that is how we are called. We are called by our given name, and we are the children of our parents. Interestingly, in Arabic, the same was true, but things have changed a little bit. The Arabic word for son is Ibn. So the great poet Ibn Gavriel, the son of Gabriel, is his name, Ibn Gavriel. He's actually the son of someone. That's how he's referred to. And that was clear throughout history. Now in Arabic, an Arab's name changes when they have their firstborn son. And it takes the name of their firstborn son. And that word is Abu, which means the father of. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.